think you can hear me.
Okay, hold on one second. Can everyone on Zoom, we're having some technical difficulties with the Zoom, but can everyone hear me? Everyone who's on Zoom?
Yes.
No, I hear you.
Okay, perfect. Okay, excellent. So I'm just going to leave audio for now. And if we get the video working, we will obviously start the video also. Okay, Derek, thank you for this. Okay, a few broad introductory, oh, fine, sorry, one other really purely logistical point before we get into broad introductory material and into our material for tonight. One other, again, purely logistical point is we aim to start at 7:30 with obviously a hard stop by Mincha Mariv, which this week is 8:20, but of course over the summer that's going to be constantly changing. So we'll adapt the length in accordance with the time that we have. We will try to figure that out. Again, I'll just ask for everybody's flexibility in advance, and we will try to make sure that we have enough time, not too much time, but enough time to cover the material in any given week's reading. So those are purely logistical introductory notes. Now, some broader introductory notes. How did this series start? There were really two, I guess, moments that motivated this series and really is the reason why we're here learning together tonight. The first is something that actually happened quite some time ago. It was not recent. It was a few years ago. When I first came to B'nai Yeshurun and we were considering what to implement and initiatives that we could put together for the shul, I was speaking to one of our congregants who's really a leading member of our shul, but never had a formal Jewish education. They were a Baal Tshuva. They came to Torah Judaism later in life. And they said one of the difficult features of being a part of Congregation B'nai Yeshurun is that, Baruch Hashem, we have a very high level of learning and very high expectations in our shul. And that's a wonderful thing. And we have many, again, very high level shiurim that we offer. But it can sometimes be a barrier. There can sometimes be a barrier to entry for those who lack basic textual skills and are certainly capable intellectually of engaging in Judaism on a serious level, and they do as much as the rest of us, but don't necessarily, again, just have the basic textual skills that many of us take for granted and that many of us received in our formal Jewish training and Jewish education. So the recommendation was made, why don't we do a serious study of an English language Torah work? There are certainly many high levels, serious and sophisticated English language Torah works, and we'll do a series on it, and that will enable everybody to participate. Everybody will have equal access to that high-level Torah learning. So I filed it away. I thought it was a great suggestion. And it was something that I've been wanting to do, but never really materialized because there are always so many things that we're trying to do and so many things that we're pursuing. It never ended up happening. But that was moment number one. Moment number two was when I discovered the book that we're going to be reading together tonight. Rabbi Brody came out with Ethics of Our Fighters. It was mostly written, I think, before October 7th, and I guess we'll hear more about the process of writing this book. When Rabbi Brody comes, when he presents to us, we'll talk a little bit about it because he writes about it in the introduction. Do people, by the way, have the text with them tonight? Do most people have it? Okay, some people have it. In the future, if you have the book, please bring it because we'll be making reference to it. So the easiest thing is to bring the book itself. In the future, I could also put together source sheets with passages, but again, easiest thing is if you have the text. That would certainly make referencing the text a lot easier. But he talks about the process of writing it. And so much of what is in here, I was very deeply enthralled with. The work itself was, I think, really compelling to me. And again, I'll begin to talk tonight about why I found it so compelling. Ironically, it was most of the later chapters. We're going to talk about the earlier chapters tonight. Of course, we're going through the book sequentially. The later chapters in particular, I found quite enthralling. And I decided, you know what? Now that I have the work and I have this idea, we're going to actually go for it. And we decided to make it happen this summer. So that was really the background of how we ended up here. And we'll try it out this year. If it works, then Be'ez Hashem, hopefully we'll have an annual summer reading series exploring a different work of Jewish thought, of Torah, of Hashkafa, of Halacha perhaps, different works over the course of, again, our this summer and future summers as well. Now, before we get into any of the material here, I want to start with Rabbi Brody's introduction. So for those who have the book with you, I'm going to start on page 19 in Roman numerals, XIX. It's really the first page of the book. It's the introduction itself. And for those who do not have the book, I will read it. It's of course in English, and I'll read it slowly and as clearly as I can, so that everyone has, so that everybody knows exactly what I'm referring to. And I think it's really the introduction that really two elements of the introduction, one here and one on the next page, that really captured, I think, why I was so enthralled by this book. He begins his introduction with the following: a story 100 years in the making. He says, several years ago, I invited one of Israel's most eminent philosophers to speak to a group of students in Jerusalem about the Israel Defense Forces Code of Ethics. So Rabbi Brody is a rabbi doctor. He's very much, again, a Talmud Chacham, a Torah scholar. He's also a PhD. If you've read the book, you'll know that he's well-versed in Torah thought as well as secular military ethics and philosophy and the like. So he was evidently conducting some kind of seminar, and he brought his students to hear about the IDF's Code of Ethics. At the end of his talk, one of the women asked how Jewish thought might impact military behavior. Okay, so it's nice to have a code of ethics for the IDF, but insofar as the IDF is the world's only Jewish army, it is the army of the Jewish state, how does Jewish thought impact military behavior? The philosopher himself, not religiously observant, but quite knowledgeable in Jewish sources, sharply responded, what could Judaism possibly teach us about military ethics? The laws of Eshes Yifas Toar, regulating how to take a captive foreign woman as a wife, were better off without it. And then he continues, this book is my response to my students' question. And I thought, to me, that was such a compelling introduction to this work. And let me try to contextualize why. The point of view of this Israeli philosopher, and evidently an eminent philosopher, an accomplished philosopher, someone who was also well-versed in Torah sources, is in many ways paradigmatic and characteristic of early secular Zionist thought. Early secular Zionist thought was perhaps proud of some elements of Jewish culture, but was not looking to it to kind of inform our perspective on the world at large. Quite to the contrary, in many ways, the new nation was looking to free ourselves from traditional rabbinic sources, let's say at least. Perhaps they would look back to the Tanakh for inspiration, but certainly rabbinic sources. The Torah of Galut was the Torah of thousands of years of exile, but now there's going to be a new Torah, and there wasn't so much attempt even, or again, I shouldn't speak in sweeping generalizations, but in many instances, there was little interest in exploring what Jewish thought had to say about the philosophical and ethical and broader conceptual issues of the day. But recently, to a large degree, that has started to change. Now, of course, again, this story happened only a few years ago, but you have begun to see a new perspective whereby there are segments of Israeli society that are starting to look to Torah for ethical guidance as well. I'll give you one example that happened quite recently, and it involves Rav Rimon, who we had speak in the shul last week. So Rav Rimon, he mentioned in passing that, I think he mentioned it when he was presenting last week, that he's part of a new Knesset pharmaceutical committee. He mentioned this, correct? Last week, for those who were here, I believe he did mention this in passing, whereby the Knesset has to make certain excruciating decisions on allotment of resources towards medical needs in Israel. There's obviously massive medical needs now. We hear about the number of fatalities, Rahman al-Aslan, and there was just another one. But we also know that there are a ton of young men who are coming back from the front with really severe and grave injuries, and who are going to need lots of medical treatment in many cases for the rest of their lives. Life is never going to be the same for them. And anyone who's been to one of these hospitals at Tel HaShomer, and you've seen the Chayalim who have lost limbs, who have suffered all sorts of other damage to vision, to hearing, etc., that the medical needs are massive. And the Knesset doesn't have the money to cover everything. They just don't. Obviously, if they did, they would want to. They would want to take care 100% of the needs of 100% of the Chayalim. Obviously, that is the ideal. But the reality is such that they cannot. They also have to prosecute a war. They also have to take care of 100,000 residents from the north that have been evacuated from their homes. The costs of this war are just astronomical. So they have to make certain excruciating decisions about how exactly they're going to allocate their funds towards different medical needs. So do you spend, if you have 100,000 shekel and a given project, are you going to use it for 2 or 3 chayalim who have very severe needs? Or are you going to treat a lesser need, but you're able to cover 100 chayalim, right? So how do you make those kinds of decisions? So they needed ethical advisors for this Knesset Pharmaceutical Committee to gear and to guide and to steer these conversations. And Rabbi Rimon was one of 2 people who were asked to take part. And originally, he shared with me, I don't think he shared this last week, but he told me that he wanted to say no. Why? Because these are obviously important conversations, but there were a lot of other things that he was doing at the time. Okay, I'm going to log out of this one, Derek, yes? We'll end up with 2 recordings, but that's okay. Can everyone see me? Okay. So it was undoubtedly an important task, but he was also involved with lots of other things at the time. He was visiting Hayalim at military bases. He was going to hospital rooms to visit Hayalim who were injured, and visiting families, etc., etc. So much he was doing. He said that he didn't really want to take part in these more intellectual conversations. He didn't feel it was the best use of his time. And he said someone sat down with him and said, the political committee is taking 2 ethical advisors to steer these extraordinarily important conversations about how the government should be spending to support medical needs among Israeli society right now. They invited a secular philosopher and you. And you have to understand that the fact that they invited you to serve as the ethical advisor is a massive step on part of Israeli society, Israeli culture, the Israeli government. The fact that they asked a Rav, who Rabbi Mon is unbelievable. I think one of the few things he hasn't done in life is receive formal training in secular medical philosophy or medical ethics. The fact that they asked you to serve as someone to guide this conversation means they are consulting Torah sources in order to guide this conversation, that they feel that Torah does have something to say about this issue. And that was a major step. And he said that's actually why he ultimately decided to join this committee. And it was a massive investment on his part. For those who were on the CBY mission, you may remember that we had to coordinate our visit to Tel HaShomer around the Knesset pharmaceutical meetings because he would be in the hospital. They would meet in Tel HaShomer. So he would meet there for hours on end. And then afterwards, he would go around to visit Hayalim. That's when we joined him to visit some of the soldiers. But the fact that you have this old school, I would say, Israeli impression that Torah has nothing meaningful to say about military ethics, and the IDF's code of ethics will be built from the ground up, will be built ex nihilo, will have to be created without any reference to thousands of years of Torah sources, is in some ways indicative of what I would describe as, again, an old school Israeli mentality. But the fact that there is a work, and I know this is in English, perhaps, I don't know if Rabbi Brody's plans to translate it into Hebrew, that's perhaps a question that we can ask him when he comes. But the fact that we have a work that is attempting to address, in a broad sweeping sense, many of the most pressing military ethical issues of the day from a Torah standpoint, in dialogue, in conversation with what secular ethics and secular wisdom has to offer, to me is a really massive contribution to Torah discourse in the contemporary world. And for, I would say, the covenant of Torah as well, that people should know that there is sophisticated, as with everything, there is sophisticated material for Torah to offer on this topic. It's something that is indeed important for people to know. I spoke this past Shavuos. Every year we do a Shavuos night shir on the topic of Torah and the modern world. I always try to take a contemporary topic and address it from a Torah standpoint. And this year our topic was the ethics of urban warfare. As you can imagine, it was somewhat fueled by passages from Rabbi Brody's book. And I always start with the same source, which is Rav Soloveitchik's 14th Animan. Rav Soloveitchik, in one of his drushos, declared that as much as we have 13 Animan, means 13 core principles of faith that are the basic substance of Jewish dogma, the most core principles of our belief in faith. He said if he had the opportunity, he would write a 14th Animan. He would write one more. What is the 14th Animan? It's about the eternal relevance of Torah. The Torah is relevant in every society, at every stage. It's relevant in the shtetl. It's relevant in the contemporary cosmopolitan society. It's relevant, it can be studied in the base medrash, it can be studied in a laboratory, and it always has eternal relevance to all of the issues of the day. And he says explicitly, even when we have a Jewish state with all sorts of new problems that have to be addressed and have not been addressed before, we can always look to the basic source material of Torah to guide us and to offer wisdom on the new realities of the day. And this work, to me, is, again, a really valuable expression of that, a way in which Torah speaks to contemporary issues that some, even in Israel, even respected philosophers, may be under the misimpression that Torah does not have what to offer. That was number one. The second passage that I think very much struck me as well was on the next page. If you look at page XX, so he writes, I'll pick up from the second paragraph. So he says, Judaism, it turns out, has much to say about these topics. It just never joined the conversation. This book is meant to change that. So that's the first point we were raising, that Torah does have what to say about these issues, and this book is meant to give voice to Torah's perspective on these issues. And then he writes as follows. Yet as much as this is a book about ethics, it is also a story. It tells the tale of how Jews were confronted anew with the moral challenges of warfare. After many centuries of not fighting, Jews were once again on the battlefield. This confrontation forced them to articulate a Jewish political worldview that protected communal interests, but also reflected Jewish beliefs. These values drew in part from teachings of classical Jewish texts, but also drew from the experiences of Jewish history. Following many centuries of powerlessness, Jews needed to ask, what does it mean to fight as a Jew? The notion that the book is not just ethics, but a story is also, again, for me personally, what I found so compelling about the book. First of all, it informs the narrative of the book. It doesn't read like as a dry philosophy. He's very much introducing you to rabbinic personalities, some of whom we'll talk about tonight, and their perspective on different issues. He's very much bringing these abstract issues to life through actual historical cases that arose from World War I through the modern day. And it is very much a story. But the notion that it's a story, to me, is a powerful reality as well, that indeed reflects, in a sense, a rebirth of areas of halacha that for thousands of years lay dormant, perhaps studied in the recesses of the Beis Medrash, perhaps left to intellectual discourse among students of Torah, but were not realized in any practical way until the current era. When I was introducing Rabbi, again, going back to Rabbi Mon's visit last week, when I was introducing him, before he spoke to the entire Shekhinah community on Wednesday night, he gave a shiur to our kollel, to our summer kollel earlier in the day. When I introduced him then, I made reference to a video that I saw that was a particularly meaningful moment. In the early days of the war, we were all being flooded with videos every single day. There was a particularly meaningful moment to me that reflects the point that Rabbi Brody is making here. There was a video of a chayal talking to his fellow chayalim before they were going into Gaza. And he was giving them a pep talk. He was speaking to them in order to arouse their spirits, in order to make sure that they had the proper morale as they were heading into battle. And he gets up, and I have no reason to believe that this was a dati chayal. He might have been, he might not have been. It was not evidently clear from the video itself. But he gets up, and he starts with the words from Devarim Parakaf, Shema Yisrael. He started with the quotation of the psukim that the Rambam in Parak Zayin, Atavos Malach Gimel says the Mashuach Milchama, the Kohen Mashuach Milchama, would give a speech before Klal Yisrael would go to war, invoking those psukim from Sefer Devarim. I'll pull up in the Lishon Tikra, the Lashon of the Pasuk right now. It appears in Sefer Shoftim. And those were the words that he used to introduce them or to kind of build their spirits as they were heading into battle. The exact words of the pasuk are Shema Yisrael atem kirevim hayom lamelchama v'hivechem. Listen, Yisrael, you are heading to war against your enemies. Do not fear. Because Hashem is going to travel with you, to wage war with you against your enemies, to deliver you. Psukim, a pasuk that we're familiar with because it appears in the text of our Mishaberach, the Chayalei Tzahal. And that's how he started his pep talk to his fellow Chayalim. And I remember thinking to myself, the last time, again, a Jewish warrior got up to encourage soldiers to go into battle using these words was probably, 2,000 years ago, more. There was a moment when that was the standard text in which the Kohen Mashuach Milchama was a Kohen who was appointed to oversee matters of war. Perhaps somewhat counterintuitive that you had a Kohen overseeing matters of war, but it goes back all the way to Pinchas ben Elazar ben Aaron Kohen, that you had this Kohen who was, again, motivating the people before they would go to war. And he was giving that same speech that was described in the Rambam in Melachim Perek Zayin Halacha Gimel. That Rambam, when again, yeshiva boys would learn that Rambam for thousands of years, it was an abstract, theoretical Rambam. It wasn't anything that had ramifications for daily life. It was a nice theoretical concept. And here you have this moment when the halacha has been reborn. Elements of halacha that were dormant for thousands of years, all of a sudden, are real again, are alive again. There's been this kind of tchias hamesim, if you will, this resurrection of entire areas of halacha that were really purely theoretical and, again, were hardly realized for thousands of years. And the fact that you have this book that he describes as a story is this expression of halacha that was always there. The Gemaras in Sanhedrin were always there. The round of him was always there. These discussions were always around. But the fact that they are now becoming real again is just to me an expression of this remarkable moment in Jewish history that we live in. This kind of aschalta de geula, this moment where you have this resurrection of areas of halacha and of the Jewish people in ways that our grandparents, great-grandparents really only could have dreamed of. It's just a remarkable statement as well about the power of the work that we are studying and its relevance to this contemporary moment. So it was really those two things, the notion that halacha does have what to say, Torah does have what to say about all contemporary issues of our time, and the fact that these are contemporary issues that are real, that Torah is revived in a certain sense through its study in a contemporary context and through its application to issues that it has not had to address for thousands of years, that rendered the work particularly powerful. Let's go through the 4 chapters that we went through tonight. Again, my input tonight is at 8:20, so I'll try to spend just 5 minutes on each of these chapters, and we'll outline some of the features of them, and I'll try to contextualize both with additional Torah sources and with applications to today. So, chapter 1 is entitled "World War I and the False Promise of Pacifism," and much of it pertains to, indeed, the ideology of pacifism, including the theology of Harav Aaron Shmuel Tamares, who was a traditional Jewish Orthodox rabbi, but also promoted the ideology of pacifism. Now, I will tell you quite openly that I was not familiar with any of his theology or ideology or the personality before reading this book. He's not somebody who kind of informs our general Hashkafa Zachayim. We'll read a lot about Rav Kook in following chapters. Rav Kook is obviously someone who has a very significant hashkafic influence on the thought of Klal Yisrael at large, our community in particular. Much of the writings of Rav Kook that are cited are writings that I have personally studied in the original at many different points. A lot of them are famous writings of Rav Kook, where he, again, Rabbi Brody does a fantastic job of collating them, of bringing them to life, of organizing them, etc. But there are a lot of famous works. He also introduces us to lesser-known rabbinic personalities. And Rabbi Tamares is one of them. And he adopted, again, a theology of pacifism and argued that Torah adopts a kind of pacifistic ideology. Now, I think Rabbi Brody does a good job, but perhaps gently, of pointing out how really untenable, in my mind, that idea is. It's entirely untenable to say that Judaism adopts a pacifistic ethic. Now, I want to be clear. Judaism very much venerates peace. Shalom. Shalom is a critical value. Shalom is one of the Shemos Hashem. We always greet other Jews with Shalom Aleichem. The question is not whether Torah values peace or places primacy on the value of peace. There's no question that Shalom is a core and central Jewish value. The question is there any circumstance in which violence is justified? Radical pacifism would assert that there's no circumstance in which violence is justified. Violence only begets more violence, and violence is never the answer. And again, it leads to rather radical conclusions where even a war of self-defense is not justified because of pacifism. So I openly confess that I have not studied Rav Tamares' works in the original. Rabbi Brody cites a lot of them in footnotes, but I think he does point out that, to me, again, it's hard to even understand how one can make the argument that Torah adopts a radical pacifism ethic. If you look throughout Tanakh is filled with war. And again, it's not something that we venerate objectively. We know famously David HaMelech, Divrei Yamim, is told that he can't build the base on Mikdash because he engaged in war. But Hashem doesn't tell him that he was wrong to engage in war, especially, again, when there were certain wars that were either wars of defense or wars that were divinely mandated, which brings us to the second piece. You don't just need to look at Torah Sheba'Tzav, but when you look at Torah Sheba'al Peh as well, we have a category of Milchemes Mitzvah. Milchemes Mitzvah means a required war. You can translate it as a holy war, but that's not an accurate translation. And given the broader connotations of holy war, I don't like it as a translation either. It's a mandated war. It's a divinely mandated war. If you believe that the divine, i.e. God, is moral, which hopefully every Orthodox Jew does, he is moral perfection, and you believe he mandates war, then it's hard for me to understand how you can claim that war is never, ever moral. It's very, very difficult to maintain. And it's not just true in Tanakh, it's not just true in the Gemara, it's true in practical halacha as well. As much as many of the halachas that we're discussing, as we highlighted a moment ago, haven't been relevant for thousands of years, there are some, at least on a more narrow level, perhaps not on a national military level, but on a personal level, that are relevant. There's a famous dictum of the Gemara in Masechah Sanhedrin of Haba l'horgacha hashkem l'horga, that if someone is coming to kill you, And the only way in which you can save yourself is by killing them. Gemara is also clear that if you have alternatives, the Gemara says there are alternative ways in which you can get the person to desist and save your life. You're not licensed to kill them, but if it's the only way to stop before they are able to kill you, and that is a halacha l'maisa. That's been the halacha in which we've had the revival of Jewish army. That's a halacha that's been on the books and in theory relevant for the last several thousand years as well. So it's very difficult to for me to understand how you can claim that the Torah embraces a kind of radical pacifism. And I think also Rabbi Brody does a good job of pointing out how it can be morally problematic at times. If you look at page 16, he provides a quote from Mahatma Gandhi that is a very infamous quote, I think. And in my mind, and in the minds of many, shows the limits and of his satyagraha, of his pacifistic civil disobedience philosophy, and the dangers of what happens when you take a philosophy and apply it to every circumstance, as opposed to recognizing that perhaps there are limits. If you look at the quote, it's again in the middle of page 16. Gandhi said, "If ever there could be a justifiable war in the name of and for humanity, a war against Germany," this is, mind you, World War II he was talking about, the end of the Holocaust, "a war against Germany to prevent the wanton persecution of a whole race would be completely justified." So if a war was ever justified, it was a war against the Nazis. Shkaya. But then he continues, "But I do not believe in any war. So we should have let the Nazis do their thing, let them complete the final solution. None of us would be here. And at least you would have avoided a war." Now, to assert that that's a morally justifiable, in my mind, again, a viewpoint, I think is absurd. Lots of times we'll use what we call reductio ad absurdum. We'll take a moral philosophy and deliberately take it to its radical conclusion to show where it breaks down, to show where it cannot apply. And if anything, this would be, a reductio ad absurdum. Gandhi, are you saying that you wouldn't even be able to fight against the Nazis in World War II? But as my Rabbi Shlomo likes to say, one man's reductio ad absurdum is another's einach hinami, which means that Gandhi would say, yeah, einach hinami, I would say that you can't fight against the Nazis in World War II. So I think that's, again, a deeply morally problematic stance. The Medrash in Koheles Rabbah famously says that a misapplication of Rahmanos, that a misapplication of mercy can itself become achzarius, can become a form of viciousness if it is misappropriated, if it's misapplied. And to me, this is a prime example of that. A radical Rahmanos, radical mercy, where you say that combat is always prohibited, there's no such thing as a just war at all, can lead to achzarius, can lead to a scenario where you're effectively telling people to be passive in the face of really just objective, horrific evil. And if I would try to, I guess, apply this, both of those points to the current era, how can you have a respected Talmud Chacham who argues that the Torah adopts pacifism, when to me it seems like quite clear that it's really an untenable position? How can you have someone who is rightly revered for his moral goodness in the world, talking about Mahatma Gandhi in a broader sense, who says that a war against the Nazis is unjustified? I think what it shows you is that there's a certain allure of simple, objective, across-the-board principles. It is very easy to say, war is bad, peace is good. There's something appealing to the human mind about that, and its simplicity, and its objectivity, and the way it applies across the board, always, to everyone. And it can almost be like a narcotic, that simplicity. It becomes so simple, and it becomes so easy for us to process, and we as human beings have a natural desire to process and to understand and to quantify and qualify the world around us. It leads us to absurd conclusions. And we very much see that nowadays. If in the context of this first chapter, we were talking about peace versus war, there's been much emphasis recently on the contemporary intellectual construct of oppressor versus oppressed. There's been a lot of talk about that. You don't need me to tell you about it, because many people have been speaking about it. But in short, there's been this new notion that there are oppressors in the world, and there are those who are oppressed. Oppressor is objectively bad, oppressed is objectively good. And it doesn't matter what is done, the oppressed, those who are labeled as oppressed, can engage in horrific, savage brutality on October 7th or before or afterwards, and that is good because they are the oppressed. And the oppressor can engage in a war of self-defense, doing their best to limit civilian casualties and doing their best just to save their people from an organization that threatens to do that savage brutality again and again and again, and that's evil. So when you have these simple narratives, there's an allure to them, there's an appeal to them. People find them comforting in a certain way, but when you see the dangers of them, the way they can be, again, over-applied, the way they can be overgeneralized, it can lead you to radical conclusions. And if in the past, after the World War I era, perhaps that was, or the interwar period, if that was the allure of pacifism, we've seen that allure of simple narratives apply in our own day in a radically different way, and one that leads to similarly problematic moral conclusions. So that is chapter 1. I'm looking at the time. We're going to get through as much as we can. If we don't get to chapter 4, that's okay. Because chapter 4 and chapter 5 are actually quite related. So perhaps we will reserve a longer discussion of chapter. Is called Total War, Religious Fundamentalism, and the Ghosts of Canaan. And in many ways, it is actually a description, or it is a discussion of how Torah deals with ethical conundrums like the mitzvah of Amalek, of Matthias Amalek. He begins with a description of total war. As I said, Rabbi Brody reveals his mastery of really, again, lots of secular wisdom as opposed to just narrowly Torah wisdom. The concept of total war, he goes through the narrow definitions. We don't need to go through all the details of it right now. And the notion of total war, as he points out, can be just. The British war effort during World War II was a total war. The war effort of the North during the Civil War, the Union Army, was a total war. It fit all the criteria of total war. So total war can be a just thing and a good thing in the right circumstances. But it can also raise certain moral questions and problems as well. And the question that he deals with from an internal Jewish standpoint is, how do we deal with that? We're told to wipe out an entire that. And he outlines what he calls two general approaches: what he calls the restrictive interpretation approach and the evolutionary ethics approach. And he attributes them to two rabbinic personalities, in this case, two rabbinic personalities that all of us here are undoubtedly quite familiar with, because they do very much shape our contemporary theology and our approach to Torah ethics in the modern world. He identifies the first with Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sachs. That sets up. What is the approach of restrictive interpretation? So Rabbi Sachs would point out that you can't just read psukim and then derive conclusions from them. There's a process through which halacha is interpreted, what we would call Torah sheba'al peh. And he says the critics of Jewish ethics, what they do is they just open up a pasuk in the Torah, they read it, they don't bother considering thousands of years of Jewish thought and interpretation and how exactly it is what we would label as properly understood through the lens of Torah sheba'al peh, through rabbinic interpretation. They just take a simple verse and the ArtScroll translation or whatever translation they're using, and then say that Judaism embraces genocide. And Rabbi Sachs pointed out, if you look at the interpretation through thousands of years of rabbinic wisdom, that is not a simple meaning of the pasuk, is not quite what the Torah means. First of all, the Rambam argues in Malachim Parakeh that you start with peace overtures. You give them an offer to make peace and to adopt Hashem Mitzvahs B'nai Noach, to adopt basic standards of universal morality. And it's only if they reject those basic peace terms that we try to make with them, then we go to war with Amalek. And he notes that according to Chazal, we have no identification of Amalek. We only have identification of Amalek as B'nai Mashiach. So it basically, restrictive interpretation means, if you look at the interpretation of the mitzvah, it's much more restrictive, it's much more narrow than a simple reading of the pasuk would mean. And that can go a long way in closing the moral gap, the question of how exactly to deal with it. That is one approach. Second approach, which Rabbi Brody prefers, which is the approach of Rav Kook, and this is again a famous letter of Rav Kook and a somewhat controversial letter of Rav Kook, is what he calls the evolutionary ethics. That, even from a Torah standpoint, ethics evolve. They evolve over time. They change over time. Whenever you use the word change, it's going to be controversial. But I'll tell you what I think Rav Kook meant and why I don't think it's as controversial as it's sometimes made out to be. And perhaps that was the ethic in the times of old. In the times of old, warfare was a brutal thing. There were no Geneva Conventions. There were no attempts to kind of mitigate the horrific carnage of war. And the Torah's commands of total warfare, of annihilating another nation, is what was necessary. That's what and that was ethical in its time. But nowadays, now that we live in a different time, it is not ethical, and we shouldn't engage in that kind of work. Now, I will point out that these two approaches are not mutually exclusive. And I also offer a third approach, or a third non-approach, that was adopted by Rabbi Nachman Zatzal, a Rebbe of mine, and a Rabbi Brody as well. But first, just a point on the Rav Kook approach to evolutionary ethics. I think a lot of people felt that Rav Kook's approach was quite controversial because it suggests that morality changes, and I think people misconstrue what Rav Kook was saying as saying that certain mitzvahs in the Torah are immoral. Now, I don't think Rav Kook would ever agree to that. As I said before, I'm pretty sure Rav Kook would agree to Torah. So if you have a morally perfect being giving you a Torah, it's very difficult to even philosophically understand how a mitzvah could be immoral, how it could be morally problematic. And I don't think that's what Rav Kook meant at all. What I do think Rav Kook meant is that even as the Torah is perfectly moral, that's again, I think, a basic tenet of our faith, the Torah does not expect perfect morality to be the baseline observance of Torah. Built into the system of Torah is a concept that we call lifnim mishuras hadin. The Torah recognizes that this is a baseline of morality, but the Torah asks and at times even expects us to go beyond that basic level of morality and to adopt higher standards. That's not a controversial concept. You look through Shas, there's notion of lifnim mishuras hadin is perhaps theologically audacious, but it's very well rooted in Jewish thought. So much so that one Gemara tells us that the reason why the Beis HaMikdash was destroyed was because people were not going lifnim mishuras hadin, because they were not going beyond the basic letter of the law. So that's a baffling Gemara. People were observing the Torah, they were observing the halacha. You were telling me they were doing everything right, and because they didn't go above and beyond, that's why the Beis HaMikdash was destroyed. But that Gemara is times, as I said before, asked and not just asked, at times even demands that you go above and beyond. What Rav Kook was saying was the Torah gave a moral dictum for the time in which the Torah was given. Mind you, the Torah is given for all eternity. It's not just given for us here in 2024 or in the early 1900s when Rav Kook was writing either. It was given for all of eternity. So it gave us a basic moral dictum, not immoral, moral dictum for its time. The Torah also recognizes that that baseline of morality is something that can and at times must be surpassed in the spirit of the Mishnah said. And Rav Kook argued in a time when the world's military ethics changed, when that kind of total warfare was no longer necessary for the basic survival of the nation, for the basic conduct of just warfare, then the Torah demands that we go above and beyond it as well. And I think that's likely what Rav Kook meant. And I think from that perspective, it is far less controversial than some of what Rav Kook is sometimes portrayed to, or sometimes what is said in the name of Rav Kook. And I think sometimes the way Rav Kook's position is presented is certainly not, cannot be what Rav Kook actually meant. So you do have these two approaches, restrictive interpretation and evolutionary ethics. There's a third approach as well. As I said, perhaps it's a non-approach, but it's an approach that was Rav Lichtenstein's preferred approach to mitzvahs like Amalek, what I would call not restrictive interpretation or evolutionary ethics, but what I would call surrendered faith. I'm not going to read the full passage right now, but for those who are interested in Rav Lichtenstein's By His Life, he talks about this on page 112. For next week, I'll Be'ez Hashem print sources so we can look at some of this inside, and I'll print some of the sources that I'm quoting this week as well, so that people can make reference to them. But he says when he was troubled by these issues of Amalek as a young man, he says, in my late adolescence, there were certain problems which perturbed me. He says his answer was not restrictive interpretation, it was not evolutionary ethics. As a matter of fact, it was not a discussion of Amalek at all. What was the answer for him? He read a story about Reb Chaim Soloveitchik. Reb Chaim Soloveitchik is known for his brilliance in Talmudic analysis. He revolutionized the world and the way in which we study Torah. Every yeshiva now studies Amalek. It's a greater or less degree with the method that Reb Chaim Soloveitchik pioneered in the 19th century. He was also known for his remarkable otherworldly Gemilos Chasadim. He was known for his chesed. And he said he had just read Rav Zevin's book, Ishim Beshitos. He read an essay on Reb Chaim Soloveitchik and his otherworldly Gemilos Chasadim. He recounted that Reb Chaim used to check every morning if some unfortunate woman had placed an infant waif on his doorstep during the course of the night. And Rav Lichtenstein writes about himself. As I read the stories about Reb Chaim's extraordinary kindness, I said to myself, do I approach this level of Gemilos Chasadim? I don't even dream of it. In terms of moral sensibility, concern for human beings, and sensitivity to human suffering, I am nothing compared to Reb Chaim. Yet despite his moral sensitivity, he managed to live deeply with the totality of halakha, including the command to destroy the seven nations, Amalek, and all the other things which bother me. How? The answer I thought was obvious. It is not that his moral sensitivity was less, but his Yiras Shamayim, his Emunah, was so much more. The thing to do then is not to try to neutralize or de-emphasize the moral element, but rather to deepen and increase the element of Yiras Shamayim, of Emunah, Dveikos, and Bitachon. So that's a third approach when we deal with these mitzvos, which is, look, we might never have the answer. It might be like Rabbi Sachs said, it might be like Rav Kook said, and I don't think the two are mutually exclusive. But ultimately, we know that the Torah is a Torah of Rahmanos, of kindness, of mercy, of compassion. We seek to instill those values in ourselves and live by those values every single day. We know that there are people far greater than us who do indeed live with the totality of Torah and exhibit those character attributes of compassion, of kindness, of generosity in a way that we do not. And ultimately, we live with faith that the Torah is perfectly moral, even if we can't explain every single facet of its moral teaching. It's 8:17, so we're not going to get to even chapter 3, which is going to put us behind a little bit. There's a lot to be said about chapter 3. Chapter 3, I think, is a remarkable chapter. Let me just offer one final concluding thought on chapter 2, and we'll find a way to hopefully implement parts of chapter 3 next week, especially if we don't have as much introductory material. Hopefully we'll be able to cover more ground. I just want to call your attention to a passage at the end of chapter 2, because I think it's a really, really important one. It appears on page 34. And here he talks about, sorry, I'm at the wrong page. At the very end of the chapter, he talks about total war. Yeah, there you go. So page 34. What if brutal tactics are sometimes necessary? He talks about the way in which lots of contemporary atheists, he makes reference to Richard Dawkins in this chapter. And again, you can read the chapter at the end of on page 34. At the end, we're not going to read it now, just to save time. But lots of people like to depict the Bible as a source of this total brutal warfare and brutality, and religious fundamentalism is the problem of that. That's the source of all evil, and religion itself is the source of all evil. If it weren't for religion, everybody would be getting along nicely in peace, and everybody would be taller and better looking, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And he notes that if you look at the total warfare as it expressed in the 20th century, almost all the most horrific crimes against humanity that occurred in the 20th century had nothing to do with, I would say, God-based religion, secular religions, perhaps, secular fundamentalism. They were not religious fundamentalists. Stalin was not motivated by religious fundamentalism. Neither was Hitler, neither was Mao. And they murdered millions because they had their own secular ideology, their own secular religion, if you will. That was the basis of their fundamentalism that killed many. Whenever people point a finger at faith and religion and say that religion is the source of holy wars, fundamentalism, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, we should never feel defensive in light of those accusations, and we should never accept the premise. It's simply not true. When you have radical ideologies, whatever form they may take, some people might embrace radical religious fundamentalism, and yes, that continues to be a problem, including for the Jewish people, ad hayom hazeh, with enemies that embrace religious fundamentalism. And other times, it's other forms of secular ideology or fundamentalism. It doesn't make a difference what form it takes. Fundamentalism is something that can lead to total warfare, but should never be falsely attributed to religion, to faith, to the Bible, to the Torah HaKadosh, chas v'shalom. We should always reject that premise because it simply isn't a true premise. It's not something that again, the Torah attempts to formulate an ethic of warfare. It attempts to attenuate mankind's worst drives, impulses, most base desires, including those towards violence and warfare. But when others try to distort that record and try to make the Torah chas v'shalom something that it's not, something that promotes violence, warfare, etc., and moral evil, it's a premise that we should very firmly reject. I look forward to continuing this as Hashem next week. We'll pick up from chapter 3, and I wish everyone a wonderful evening.